My name is Jean, and I am 53 years old. For 28 years, I raised my son Marcus as a single mother, pouring every ounce of love and sacrifice into giving him the best life possible. 3 days before what should have been the happiest day of his life, his wedding was suddenly cancelled. Everyone blamed me. They said I destroyed my son's happiness, that I was a controlling mother who couldn't let go. But nobody asked for my side of the story. Nobody wanted to hear the truth about what really happened and why that celebration could never have taken place. Today, I'm finally ready to tell you everything. Before I share this story with you, please let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to hear more real-life stories that matter. Now let me take you back to 3 months before everything fell apart, when my world changed forever. It was a crisp October evening when Marcus first brought Stephanie home to meet me. I had been looking forward to this moment for weeks. My son had been dating someone special, he said, and wanted me to meet her. I spent the entire day cleaning the house, preparing his favorite meal, and making sure everything was perfect. When the doorbell rang, I opened it to find my handsome son standing next to a stunning young woman. Stephanie was everything you might imagine from a perfect girlfriend. She had long auburn hair that caught the light, beautifully bright green eyes, and a smile that could light up any room. She wore an elegant navy dress that showed she had excellent taste, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from success. "Mom, this is Stephanie," Marcus said, his face glowing with happiness. "Stephanie, this is my mother, Jean." "Mrs. Anderson, it's such a pleasure to finally meet you," Stephanie said, extending her hand with a firm grip. "Marcus talks about you constantly. I've been so excited for this dinner." Everything seemed wonderful on the surface. Stephanie complimented my cooking, admired my home, and asked thoughtful questions about my work at the local library. She told us about her job as a marketing coordinator at a downtown firm, her apartment in the trendy part of the city, and her love for hiking and photography. But as the evening progressed, I began to notice small things that made me uncomfortable. Whenever Marcus started to tell a story about his childhood or our family traditions, Stephanie would somehow redirect the conversation back to herself or to their relationship. When I asked Marcus about his recent promotion at the engineering firm, Stephanie answered for him, explaining how proud she was and how she had helped him prepare for the interview. "Jean, you really should consider updating your kitchen," Stephanie said as I served dessert. "These cabinets are so outdated, and this color scheme is very 1990s. I could give you the name of an excellent interior designer." Marcus laughed. "Mom's always been practical about decorating. She's not really into trendy stuff." "Well, that's exactly the problem," Stephanie continued. "A home should reflect growth and evolution. Staying stuck in the past isn't healthy." I felt a small knot form in my stomach. This wasn't just casual conversation. There was something calculated about the way she spoke, as if she was already planning to change things. As the evening wore on, I noticed that Marcus seemed different around her. He was quieter than usual, constantly checking her expressions before he spoke. When I brought out photo albums to show Stephanie pictures from Marcus's childhood, she flipped through them quickly, making polite but dismissive comments. "Oh, Marcus was such a serious child," she said, looking at a picture of him at his high school graduation. "It's so good that he's learning to be more spontaneous now." The comments stung because Marcus had always been thoughtful and careful qualities I had nurtured and admired. But Stephanie made it sound like these were flaws that needed correction. When they were leaving, Stephanie hugged me goodbye and whispered, "I'm going to take such good care of him, Jean. You don't need to worry anymore." The words should have been comforting, but they felt like a warning. As I watched them drive away, Marcus's arm around her shoulders, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Something about Stephanie didn't feel right, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. That night I lay awake thinking about the evening. Every instinct I had developed as a mother over 28 years was telling me to be careful. But Marcus looked so happy, and I desperately wanted him to find love and build a life of his own. I decided to give Stephanie the benefit of the doubt and see how things developed. 2 weeks later, Marcus called with news that would change everything. "Mom, I have something incredible to tell you. I asked Stephanie to marry me and she said yes. We're going to have the wedding in 3 months right after the holidays. Isn't that amazing?" My heart should have leaped with joy, but instead, it sank. 3 months was incredibly fast for a wedding, especially for someone as careful and methodical as Marcus. But I forced excitement into my voice and congratulated them both. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to lose my son to someone who didn't truly know or appreciate him. The next 3 months became a whirlwind of wedding planning, but not in the way I had always imagined it would be. I had dreamed of helping my son plan his special day, of being involved in choosing flowers, tasting cakes, and sharing in all the little decisions that make a wedding memorable. Instead, I found myself increasingly pushed to the sidelines, while Stephanie took control of every detail. "Jean, I've already chosen the caterer," Stephanie announced during one of our first planning meetings. "They're very exclusive and hard to book, but I have connections through my work." "That's wonderful," I replied. "Could I see the menu options? I'd love to help with the food choices." "Oh, that's not necessary. I've already finalized everything. Marcus and I have very sophisticated tastes, and I want this wedding to reflect our style." I looked at Marcus, expecting him to invite me into the conversation, but he just nodded along. "Stephanie has great taste, Mum. She knows what she's doing." This pattern repeated itself over and over. When I suggested adding some of Marcus's favorite childhood dishes to the reception menu, Stephanie politely but firmly declined, saying they didn't fit the aesthetic vision she had created. When I offered to help with flower arrangements, she had already selected an expensive florist who specialized in what she called editorial-style weddings. "I think daisies would be lovely," I suggested during a discussion about centerpieces. They were always Marcus's favorite flowers when he was little. Stephanie laughed, but not in a warm way. "Daisies are so common, Jean. We're going with white orchids and eucalyptus, much more elegant and timeless." The guest list became another source of tension. I had assumed that my closest friends, women who had watched Marcus grow up and supported us through difficult times, would naturally be invited. These were people who had celebrated every milestone with us, from his first steps to his college graduation. "I'm sorry, but we're keeping the guest list very tight," Stephanie explained when I asked about inviting my friend Margaret, who had been like a grandmother to Marcus. "It's really just immediate family and our closest friends. But Margaret practically raised Marcus with me. She's family in every way that matters. I understand your attachment, but this is our wedding. We need to prioritize the people who are part of our current lives, not just our past." Marcus, who would have defended Margaret fiercely just months earlier, remained silent. It was as if Stephanie had slowly erased his memory of who he used to be and what mattered to him. The most painful moment came when we were discussing the wedding ceremony itself. I had always imagined giving a short speech about Marcus, sharing stories about the wonderful man he had become, and welcoming his new wife into our family. "Actually, we've decided to keep the ceremony very streamlined," Stephanie said when I brought up the idea. "No parent speeches or personal anecdotes. We want it to feel modern and sophisticated, not overly sentimental." "But it's traditional for the mother of the groom to speak," I protested gently. "Traditions can be outdated, Jean. This day is about Marcus and me starting our new life together. We don't need to dwell on the past." Every conversation felt like a small battle that I was losing. Stephanie had an answer for everything, always phrased in a way that made my suggestions seem old-fashioned or inappropriate. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed to have completely bought into her vision of their perfect life. I began to notice other changes in my son. He stopped calling me as frequently, and when he did, our conversations were shorter and more superficial. He no longer shared details about his work or asked for my advice about decisions he was facing. When I mentioned feeling left out of the wedding planning, he sighed and said, "Mom, you need to let us handle this. Stephanie knows what she's doing, and I trust her completely." But the most troubling change was how he spoke about our family history and traditions. Things that had always been important to him suddenly became embarrassments, to be hidden or minimized. Our annual Christmas morning tradition of making pancakes together became too time-consuming for their new holiday schedule. The small family cabin where we had spent countless weekends became too rustic for entertaining Stephanie's friends. As the wedding date approached, I felt like I was watching my son disappear into someone else's vision of who he should be. Every instinct I had as his mother told me that something was terribly wrong, but I didn't know how to fight an enemy who smiled sweetly while slowly erasing everything that made Marcus who he was. The final straw came when I offered to pay for the flowers as my contribution to the wedding. "That's very generous," Stephanie said, "but we've already handled all the payments. We don't need any financial help from family." Later, I learned that she had charged the flowers to a credit card in Marcus's name, along with thousands of dollars in other wedding expenses that she had somehow convinced him to take responsibility for. My son, who had always been careful with money and saved diligently for his future, was going into debt for a wedding that felt nothing like the celebration he would have chosen for himself. That's when I knew I had to dig deeper into who Stephanie really was and what she was doing to my son. Something deep in my mother's heart told me I needed to learn more about the woman my son was about to marry. It wasn't suspicion born from jealousy or possessiveness. It was the same protective instinct that had kept Marcus safe his entire life, and it was screaming at me that something was wrong. I started with simple internet searches, the kind any concerned parent might do. Stephanie's social media profiles painted the picture of a successful, well-traveled young woman. Her Instagram was filled with beautiful photos from expensive restaurants, weekend trips to wine country, and professional headshots that suggested a thriving career. But as I looked more closely, I began to notice inconsistencies. Her LinkedIn profile listed her current job as a senior marketing coordinator at a prestigious downtown firm. However, when I searched for the company's website and employee directory, there was no mention of anyone named Stephanie. The photos she posted from work events showed her at generic business gatherings, the kind anyone could attend by buying a ticket. I decided to drive past the address she had given Marcus for her apartment. What I found was a building that had been converted into short-term rental units, the kind of place someone might stay temporarily while looking for permanent housing. When I casually asked the building manager if she knew Stephanie, she told me that no one by that name had a lease there. My hands were shaking as I realized that Stephanie had been lying about fundamental aspects of her life. But I needed more information before I could approach Marcus with my concerns. I knew he would dismiss my worries as those of an overprotective mother unless I had concrete evidence. Through a mutual friend who worked in the downtown business district, I managed to contact someone who claimed to know Stephanie from previous jobs. What I learned made my blood run cold. "Oh, you mean Stephanie Williams," the woman said when I described her. "I wondered what happened to her. She worked at our company for about 6 months last year before she was let go for financial irregularities. Nothing was ever proven, but there were concerns about expense reports and client accounts. Financial irregularities. I asked, my heart pounding. She had a way of getting male colleagues to cover expenses for her, always with promises to pay them back later. She was very charming and convincing. A few guys got burned before management caught on and decided to let her go quietly to avoid a scandal. This information led me to search public records, where I discovered even more troubling details. Stephanie had been involved in several small claims court cases over unpaid debts. She had defaulted on credit cards and personal loans, leaving a trail of financial damage in her wake. But the most shocking discovery came when I found her on a social media platform she probably thought no one would check. Her account under a slightly different name revealed a completely different version of her life. Photos showed her with other men, clearly in romantic relationships, with captions suggesting ongoing commitments that overlapped with her relationship with Marcus. One post from just 2 months earlier showed her at what appeared to be another man's family gathering, with her arms around an older couple, and a caption that read, "So grateful for my future in-laws and the amazing family I'm marrying into." My stomach lurched as I realized what I was seeing. Stephanie wasn't just lying about her job and her apartment. She appeared to be maintaining multiple relationships simultaneously, possibly leading several men to believe they were her only serious commitment. I knew I had to find someone who could give me more information about Stephanie's relationship patterns. Through careful searching and some help from a friend who worked in private investigations, I managed to contact David, a man who had dated Stephanie for nearly 2 years before their relationship ended abruptly about 18 months ago. "I can't tell you how relieved I am that someone else is asking these questions," David said when I called him. "Stephanie nearly destroyed my relationship with my family before I figured out what she was doing." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand the pattern. "She slowly isolated me from everyone who cared about me," he explained. "She convinced me that my parents were too controlling, that my friends were holding me back from reaching my potential. She had a way of making me feel like she was the only person who truly understood and supported me." David went on to describe exactly what I was witnessing with Marcus. Stephanie had systematically undermined his relationships with family and friends while positioning herself as his only source of emotional support and validation. "The scary part was how gradual it was," David continued. "She never directly told me to cut people out of my life. She just made subtle comments about how much happier and more successful I could be without their negative influence. Before I knew it, I was planning to propose to someone who had essentially erased my entire support system." "What made you realize what was happening?" I asked. "My sister found out that Stephanie had been lying about her job and her finances. When I confronted Stephanie, she became furious and accused my family of trying to sabotage our relationship. That's when I finally saw how she had been manipulating me all along." David also confirmed my suspicions about Stephanie's pattern of maintaining multiple relationships. "She was very good at compartmentalizing," he said. "She would disappear for days at a time, claiming work obligations or family emergencies. I later found out she was probably with other men during those times." As I gathered this information, I felt sick, knowing that my son was being subjected to the same manipulation that had nearly destroyed David's life. But I also knew that approaching Marcus with these revelations would be incredibly difficult. Stephanie had already begun isolating him from me, and any criticism I raised would likely be dismissed as maternal jealousy or an inability to accept his adult independence. I decided to compile all the evidence I had gathered and present it to Marcus in the clearest, most factual way possible. I prepared copies of the public records screenshots of the inconsistencies in her social media profiles and contact information for David in case Marcus wanted to hear directly from someone who had experienced Stephanie's manipulation. The day I planned to talk to my son Stephanie, somehow sensed that I had been investigating her background. She arrived at Marcus's apartment while I was there and immediately confronted me. "I know what you've been doing, Jean," she said, her sweet facade completely gone. "You've been digging into my personal life and spreading lies about me." "I've been trying to protect my son," I replied as calmly as I could. "And everything I've found is documented fact, not lies. You're a bitter woman who can't stand to see Marcus happy with someone else. You've been trying to sabotage our relationship from the beginning because you can't bear to let go of your control over him." The confrontation escalated quickly, with Stephanie making increasingly outrageous accusations about my motives and my character. When Marcus arrived home and found us arguing, he immediately took Stephanie's side without even asking what the argument was about. "Mom, this has to stop," he said. "You're embarrassing yourself and ruining what should be the happiest time of our lives." As they asked me to leave, Stephanie delivered what felt like a final blow. "After the wedding, I think it would be best if we limit contact with family members who can't respect our boundaries. Marcus deserves to start fresh without negative influences from his past." I drove home that evening, knowing that I was running out of time to save my son from making the biggest mistake of his life. The confrontation with Stephanie had clearly backfired. Instead of opening Marcus's eyes to her true nature, it had pushed him further away from me and deeper into her web of manipulation. For the next week, my son refused to take my calls or respond to my messages. When I tried to visit him at work, his secretary told me he was too busy to see me. I had never felt more desperate or alone in my life. Every motherly instinct told me that I was losing my son to someone who would ultimately destroy him, but my efforts to protect him were being twisted into evidence of my own selfishness and inability to let go. During those sleepless nights, I questioned everything. Was I really just a controlling mother who couldn't accept her son's independence? Was my dislike of Stephanie based on legitimate concerns, or just jealousy over losing my place as the most important woman in Marcus's life? But then I would remember David's story and the documented evidence of Stephanie's lies and financial irresponsibility. This wasn't about my comfort or my feelings. It was about protecting someone I loved from a person who had already demonstrated a pattern of manipulating and deceiving the men in her life. 1 week before the wedding, I made the decision to try one final time to reach my son. I wrote him a letter explaining everything I had discovered about Stephanie, including copies of all the evidence I had gathered. I asked him to consider postponing the wedding until he could verify her claims about her job, her living situation, and her financial stability. When I delivered the letter to his apartment, Marcus read it in front of me, his face growing darker with each page. When he finished, he looked at me with more anger than I had ever seen in his eyes. "This is sick, Mom," he said, his voice cold and distant. "You've been stalking my fiancée, digging into her private life, and manufacturing evidence to try to break us up." "Marcus, these are public records. I didn't manufacture anything. Please just verify the information yourself before you dismiss it." "I don't need to verify anything because I trust the woman I'm going to marry, and I certainly don't need my mother's permission to live my life." The conversation became heated, with Marcus accusing me of being manipulative and destructive. He said things that cut deep into my heart, suggesting that I had always been too involved in his life and that Stephanie was helping him become more independent and self-reliant. "Maybe it's time for me to cut ties with people who can't support my happiness," he said finally. "Stephanie was right about you from the beginning." As he asked me to leave and not contact him again until after the wedding, I realized that Stephanie's manipulation had been even more effective than I had feared. She had successfully positioned herself as the victim of my alleged interference, while painting me as the villain who was trying to destroy their love. That evening, I sat in my empty house, feeling like I had failed as a mother in the most fundamental way possible. I had raised Marcus to be independent and capable, but somehow that strength was now being used against both of us by someone who understood exactly how to exploit his best qualities. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Stephanie accelerated the wedding preparations. She moved into Marcus's apartment permanently, claiming that her lease had ended early and it made more sense for them to live together before the wedding. I later learned that she had been evicted from her previous place for non-payment of rent, but Marcus believed her story about wanting to save money for their future together. During this time, I noticed that Stephanie had gained access to Marcus's financial accounts and credit cards. She made several large purchases for the wedding and their new life together, always with explanations about investments in their future or special deals that required immediate action. Marcus, who had always been careful with money and consulted me about major financial decisions, was suddenly making choices that seemed completely out of character. When I heard through mutual friends that he had taken out a personal loan to cover wedding expenses, I knew that Stephanie's influence over him had reached dangerous levels. 3 days before the wedding, I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. The caller identified herself as Lisa, Stephanie's younger sister, and she was clearly upset. "I've been trying to decide whether to call you," she said. "I know Stephanie would be furious if she found out, but I can't let your son marry her without knowing the truth." My hands were trembling as I listened to what Lisa had to tell me. The truth about Stephanie was even worse than I had imagined, and it involved criminal behavior that could destroy not just Marcus's heart, but his entire future. Lisa's voice was shaking as she began to tell me things about her sister that made my worst fears seem insignificant by comparison. "Mrs. Anderson, I need you to know that Stephanie isn't who she pretends to be. She's never been who she pretends to be." The first bombshell Lisa dropped was about Stephanie's marital status. She's still legally married to her first husband, Robert. They never got divorced. She told him she was going to visit family in another state and just never came back. That was 3 years ago. I felt like the room was spinning. But surely Marcus knows this. They applied for a marriage license together. She's been using false documentation, Lisa explained. Stephanie has been living under a slightly altered identity for the past 2 years. Her real name is Stephanie Patricia Williams, but she's been using Stephanie Marie Wilson for everything related to your son. This information was staggering, but Lisa wasn't finished. She went on to explain that Stephanie had been married twice, before Robert both times, to men who thought they were her first husband. In each case, she had disappeared when the relationships became too complicated or when her lies began to unravel. She has a pattern, Lisa said. She finds successful men who are kind and trusting, usually guys who are close to their families. Then she slowly isolates them while gaining access to their finances. She's stolen money from all of her previous relationships. But why haven't the police been involved? Why hasn't someone stopped her? Because she's very careful never to take enough to trigger serious criminal charges, and she always disappears before anyone can build a case against her. The men are usually too embarrassed to pursue it because they feel stupid for being fooled. Lisa then revealed the most terrifying part of Stephanie's current situation. She's in serious debt to some very dangerous people. She owes money to loan sharks and has been using her relationships to stay ahead of her creditors. Marrying your son isn't just about manipulating him. She needs his financial resources to stay alive. The picture Lisa painted was of a woman who was not just psychologically manipulative, but potentially dangerous. Stephanie's debts had apparently reached a point where she was receiving threats from people who wouldn't hesitate to hurt her or anyone associated with her. I tried to warn Robert before she left him, but he didn't believe me until it was too late. Lisa continued. She had cleaned out their joint savings account and run up massive debt on credit cards in his name. It took him 2 years to recover financially, and he still doesn't know where she is. Lisa also confirmed that the apartment Stephanie claimed to live in was actually a short-term rental that she had been staying in illegally after the paid period ended. The building management had been trying to evict her, which explained why she had moved in with Marcus so suddenly. The job she claims to have. She was fired 6 months ago for falsifying expense reports and trying to steal from petty cash. She's been surviving by borrowing money from men she meets online, usually with promises of romantic relationships that never materialize. As I listened to these revelations, I felt sick thinking about how thoroughly Stephanie had deceived my son, but I also felt a growing sense of urgency. If Lisa was right about the dangerous people Stephanie owed money to, Marcus could be putting himself at risk by associating with her. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Why haven't you tried to stop her before?" "Because I was afraid," Lisa admitted. Stephanie can be very vindictive when people cross her. But when I found out she was planning to actually go through with a wedding ceremony, I realized she was crossing a line that could seriously hurt an innocent person. Lisa went on to explain that she had been gathering evidence about Stephanie's activities, including copies of financial documents and recordings of conversations where Stephanie had admitted to her schemes. She was willing to share this information with me, but only if I promised to use it to protect Marcus rather than to seek revenge against her sister. "I love Stephanie, but she's sick," Lisa said. "She needs help, but she also needs to be stopped before she destroys someone else's life." I spent the rest of that day reviewing the evidence Lisa provided and consulting with a family attorney about the legal implications of what I had learned. The attorney confirmed that, if even half of what Lisa had told me was true, Stephanie could be charged with fraud identity theft and potentially bigamy. But more immediately, the attorney explained that any marriage ceremony between Marcus and Stephanie would be legally invalid because of her existing marriage to Robert. This meant that Marcus could unknowingly become involved in a bigamous relationship, which could have serious legal consequences for him. Armed with this information and Lisa's evidence, I knew I had to act quickly. The wedding was scheduled for the day after tomorrow, and hundreds of people had been invited to what would essentially be a fraudulent ceremony. I called Marcus one more time, hoping that the seriousness of the situation would break through Stephanie's influence over him. When he refused to see me, I realized that I would have to find another way to get his attention and make him listen to the truth. That's when I decided to attend the rehearsal dinner and make the information public in front of all the wedding guests, including Stephanie herself. It was a desperate move, but I couldn't think of any other way to save my son from making a mistake that could ruin his life both legally and financially. The rehearsal dinner was being held at an upscale restaurant that Stephanie had chosen for its sophisticated ambiance. As I walked into the elegantly decorated private dining room, I felt like I was entering a lion's den. Nearly 60 people were gathered to celebrate Marcus and Stephanie's upcoming wedding, including her supposed family and friends, alongside Marcus's colleagues and our relatives. Stephanie was holding court at the center of the room, radiant in a flowing emerald dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She looked every inch the beautiful, successful bride, to be accepting congratulations and admiring comments about her wedding preparations with gracious smiles and warm hugs. Marcus stood beside her, handsome in his navy suit, but I noticed something different about him. He seemed nervous and distracted, not like a man celebrating the eve of the happiest day of his life. When our eyes met across the room, I saw a flicker of uncertainty that gave me hope that some part of him still questioned what was happening. "Jean," Stephanie called out when she noticed me. "I'm so surprised to see you here. I didn't think you were planning to attend after our recent conversation." Every person in the room turned to look at me, and I felt the weight of their expectations. Most of these people knew nothing about my concerns regarding Stephanie. To them, I was probably just an overprotective mother who was having trouble letting go of her son. "I wouldn't miss this for anything," I replied, keeping my voice steady. After all, it's not every day that someone learns the truth about the person they're about to marry. The room fell silent, and I could feel the tension building like electricity before a storm. Stephanie's smile remained perfect, but I caught a flash of panic in her eyes that confirmed she knew exactly why I was there. "Mom," Marcus said, walking over to me with a strained expression. "Please don't do this here. Whatever issues you have, they can wait until after the wedding." "Actually, Marcus, they can't wait. Because if this wedding happens tomorrow, you'll be committing a crime without even knowing it." The gasp that went through the room was audible. Stephanie stepped forward, her facade finally cracking as she realized I had information that could destroy everything she had built. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, addressing the entire room, "I need to share some information with all of you because people I care about are about to make decisions based on lies." I pulled out the folder of evidence that Lisa had provided, along with copies of the public records I had discovered through my own investigation. My hands were steady now, fueled by the certainty that I was doing the right thing, regardless of the consequences. The woman you know as Stephanie Wilson is actually Stephanie Williams, and she is currently married to another man. Any ceremony performed tomorrow would be bigamous and legally invalid. The room erupted in shocked murmurs and confused conversations. Marcus stared at me in disbelief, while Stephanie's face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "That's absolutely ridiculous," Stephanie said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Jean is clearly having some kind of breakdown. She's been harassing me for weeks with wild accusations and conspiracy theories." "These aren't theories," I replied, holding up copies of marriage certificates and court documents. "These are public records showing 3 previous marriages, substantial debts, and a pattern of financial fraud that stretches back over 5 years. I looked directly at my son as I continued. "Marcus, the woman you think you're marrying, doesn't exist. She has no job, no apartment, and no intention of building an honest life with you. She needs your financial resources to escape debts to dangerous people who have been threatening her safety." The evidence I presented was overwhelming and undeniable. Lisa had provided documentation that showed Stephanie's real identity, her financial situation, and recorded conversations where she had admitted to manipulating previous boyfriends. There were bank statements showing bounced checks, eviction notices, and small claims court judgments that painted a picture of someone living completely outside the law. But the most damning evidence was the marriage certificate showing that Stephanie Patricia Williams had married Robert Chen in Nevada 3 years earlier, with no subsequent divorce decree on file anywhere in the country. "This is insane," Marcus said, but I could see doubt creeping into his expression as he looked at the official documents. "Stephanie, tell them this is all a mistake." For the first time since I had known her, Stephanie seemed to have no immediate answer. She looked around the room at the faces staring at her with growing suspicion and realized that her usual charm and manipulation tactics wouldn't work in this situation. "I can explain everything," she finally said, but her voice was shaking. "There are circumstances that Jean doesn't understand. Yes, I made some mistakes in my past, but that doesn't change how I feel about Marcus." "What about Robert?" I asked quietly. "What about the man who still thinks he's married to you?" The question hung in the air, like a challenge that Stephanie couldn't deflect or explain away. Marcus stared at her, waiting for an answer that would make sense of everything he had just learned. "Robert and I were separated," she said weakly. "It was essentially over, even though we never filed the paperwork. But Marcus didn't know that when he proposed to you, did he? He thought you had never been married before." The truth was written all over her face. Marcus looked like he had been physically struck as he realized the depth of the deception that had been perpetrated against him. "I need to talk to you privately," he said to Stephanie, his voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, please don't let her manipulate you again," I said. "Ask her about the job she claims to have. Ask her about the apartment she says she lives in. Ask her where she got the money for all these wedding expenses." As the room watched in stunned silence, Marcus began asking Stephanie the questions I had posed. With each question, her explanations became more convoluted and less believable. The confident, sophisticated woman who had charmed everyone for months was revealing herself to be someone desperate and dishonest. The breaking point came when Marcus's cousin Sarah, who worked in background investigations for a law firm, pulled out her phone and began verifying the information I had provided. Within minutes, she confirmed that Stephanie's supposed employer had never heard of her and that the address she had given Marcus for her apartment was actually a building that had been condemned 6 months earlier. "I think we should cancel tomorrow's ceremony," Marcus said finally, his voice hollow with shock and disappointment. As the guests began to file out in awkward silence, I watched Stephanie gather her things and prepare to leave. For just a moment, our eyes met across the room, and I saw not anger or hatred, but something like relief. Perhaps being exposed was easier than continuing to live the elaborate lies she had constructed. Marcus stood alone in the middle of the emptying room, looking lost and broken. My heart ached for him, but I also felt a profound relief that he was safe from what could have been a devastating mistake. 3 months have passed since that terrible evening at the rehearsal dinner, and I'm sitting in my kitchen, watching my son help me prepare Sunday lunch just like we used to do when he was younger. The healing process has been slow and sometimes painful, but we've found our way back to each other stronger than before. In the weeks immediately following the cancelled wedding, Marcus was devastated. He had to deal with not only the heartbreak of discovering that someone he loved had been lying to him, but also the embarrassment of having been so thoroughly deceived in front of all his friends and colleagues. The financial damage was significant too. Stephanie had charged thousands of dollars to credit cards in his name, and he spent months working with attorneys and financial advisors to clean up the mess she had left behind. But perhaps the hardest part for Marcus was coming to terms with how completely he had been manipulated. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," he told me during one of our long conversations about what had happened. "She isolated me from everyone who cared about me, and I actually helped her do it." We talked about how manipulation works, how someone like Stephanie preys on the best qualities in people, like kindness, trust, and the desire to love and be loved. Marcus began to understand that his willingness to believe in her and support her dreams wasn't a weakness, but rather evidence of his capacity for loyalty and commitment. "You saw through her when I couldn't," he said to me one evening. "I'm sorry I didn't listen to you sooner. I'm sorry I said those terrible things when you were just trying to protect me." The apology meant everything to me. but what mattered more was seeing my son slowly reclaim his sense of self. He began spending time again with friends that Stephanie had convinced him were negative influences. He returned to hobbies and interests that she had dismissed as childish or unproductive. Most importantly, he started making decisions based on his own values and judgment, rather than trying to please someone else. We also learned what happened to Stephanie after the truth came out. Lisa stayed in contact with me for several weeks, providing updates about her sister's situation. Stephanie had apparently fled the state immediately after the rehearsal dinner, leaving behind substantial debts and angry creditors. The last Lisa heard, she was living under yet another false identity, probably targeting a new victim in a different city. "I hope she gets help someday," Marcus said when I shared this information with him, "but I'm grateful that it won't be at my expense." The legal consequences of Stephanie's actions were complex. While what she had done was clearly fraudulent, proving criminal intent across multiple states and jurisdictions was difficult enough that prosecutors were reluctant to pursue charges. Robert, her legal husband, had moved on with his life and didn't want to get involved in legal proceedings. In the end, Stephanie faced some civil judgments for unpaid debts, but she managed to escape serious criminal penalties by disappearing before cases could be fully developed. Through this experience, both Marcus and I learned important lessons about trust intuition and the courage required to speak uncomfortable truths. I learned that sometimes protecting someone you love means being willing to be seen as the villain, at least temporarily. Marcus learned that real love doesn't require you to abandon your family, your friends, or your fundamental sense of who you are. "I think I understand now why you never remarried after Dad died," Marcus said to me recently. "You didn't want to bring someone into our family who might change what we had together." "Actually," I replied, "I never remarried because I never found someone who would add to our family rather than trying to replace it. Someday you'll find someone who loves you for exactly who you are, including your close relationship with your mother and your appreciation for simple traditions like Sunday pancakes." We've returned to many of our old traditions, but with a new appreciation for why they matter. Our weekly dinners aren't just about sharing a meal. They're about maintaining connections that ground us and remind us of our values. The friends that Stephanie had dismissed as unimportant have welcomed Marcus back with understanding and support, proving their worth in ways that no manipulation could undermine. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus has developed a much stronger sense of his own judgment and intuition. He's more cautious now about people who seem too perfect or who push for rapid intimacy and commitment, but he hasn't become cynical or closed off to love. Instead, he's learned to value gradual, honest relationship building over dramatic gestures and whirlwind romance. "The right person will want to know my family and be part of my existing life," he told me. "They won't try to erase my past or make me choose between them and everyone else I care about." As I watch my son rebuilding his confidence and his life, I'm struck by how this terrible experience has ultimately made him wiser and stronger. He learned firsthand how important it is to trust his instincts and to surround himself with people who genuinely care about his well-being. The most profound lesson for both of us has been about the nature of real love versus manipulation. Real love doesn't isolate you from your support system. It integrates you into a larger community of care and connection. Real love doesn't require you to change fundamental aspects of your personality. It celebrates who you are while encouraging growth and development. Real love doesn't create financial instability or legal jeopardy. It builds security and shared responsibility. "Thank you for being brave enough to tell me the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it," Marcus said to me last week. "I know it cost you a lot to stand up to both of us that night. The truth is that it cost me everything temporarily, but it saved everything that really mattered in the long run. Sometimes love requires us to be willing to be misunderstood, criticized, and even temporarily rejected in order to protect someone from serious harm. Today, as we cook together and share stories about our week, I'm grateful for the hard-won wisdom that came from this experience. I'm grateful that my son learned these lessons at 28, rather than after years of marriage and possibly children. I'm grateful that our relationship survived the strain and emerged even stronger. But mostly, I'm grateful that I trusted my instincts and found the courage to speak up when it mattered most. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to watch silently while someone you care about makes a decision that will destroy their life. Have you ever had to make a difficult decision to protect someone you love, even when they didn't want your protection? Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace and speaking a difficult truth? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the importance of trusting our instincts when something feels wrong. Don't forget to subscribe to hear more real-life stories about the complicated choices we face when we love someone enough to fight for their well-being. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it gives you the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Remember that sometimes the greatest act of love is being willing to be temporarily hated in order to prevent permanent harm.